Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another little connection spot for us for Pages in Process. I have been thinking a lot about what is this project? How does it exist in my life? What is it here for? How do I want to connect with you? And I've been cycling through a lot of different things. Number one is the last several of my videos, I've been focusing on having enough structure to feel safe enough to trust myself to keep coming back into connection with you once a week on Sundays, structured enough to feel safe sharing something here on YouTube. And that, like, even just saying that, my entire sense of self goes, I'm scared. I don't want to. I'm scared. I don't want to. I'm scared. I don't want to. And you might ask, then why are you? And truthfully, a series of visions I had many years ago when I had asked for a shift in my life that I really wanted, because there was an energy inside of me that I felt had never had a chance to really live or be free or be fully expressed or meet the world, that it was sort of my private experience of what I felt in my sense of self. And I felt like there was no place for that energy in the world. And while there's some degree of clarity that I've gained and gleaned about why that is, that I don't want to get into now, but I have in some of my earlier videos, and unpacking the pressures and the fear of the external gaze in society, that I want to find a way where, regardless of what I'm afraid of, I can keep showing up as myself, even as I might feel afraid, even as I might feel a lot of symptoms wanting to crop up, that I'm able to breathe through them enough and not avoid the topic or conversation or lie about it, but like right now specifically, I'm like, I don't want to go into the details, because I know that if I do, even just saying it very succinctly would just be triggering for me in this moment. And while I've had a lot of feedback from those of you who followed my work, that part of me having those hard conversations is really important for you in your own sense of orientation in the world and your healing process and your clarity of mind and spirit. I love hearing that from you, and I'm so grateful for that. And it takes its toll, and it's scary. And I also, at the same time as I do really want to keep doing things like that, I know that just for my resiliency and my personal goals, I really want to feel steady in my life. I really want to feel a sense of consistency with myself and my practice. And right now, and for a while, Pages in Process has been a space for me to discover what happens if I share as I'm figuring out what I'm sharing. What happens if I find clarity and let myself practice that a little bit? Maybe I like the way my shares are going for a while, and I can feel a little habitual in that, my creative process. And then when that starts to feel like, okay, well, I've stretched there enough, I've practiced that enough. Now I'm curious for the next layer. What could I share in a different way? One that is exciting to me, one that feels good, one that's relational, and one that maybe is even doing something that in the past I'd been afraid of or felt like, I don't know why anyone would care. Even as people have said, I'd love it if you would share like this, I'm like, oh, but why would you care? I don't know if you relate to that, but that's a lot of my practice, or sharing things in a way that's not necessarily super digestible. And I have been reconciling with the clarity that, because of a lot of complex trauma and because of a lot of the intergenerational neurodivergent way of being in the world, that my experience is, in my internal life, both emotionally and mentally, are either highly chaotic and conflictual, or really free and flowing, but not necessarily threading something through in a way that feels like I'm able to track myself. And I want to be able to feel held by myself while moving in a direction, while also allowing there to be freedom in the process. All these things sound so good to me. And so that's what we're here to do. And today I thought I would share with you some of the books that I have been using in my daily December embodiment series, which I'm doing over on my other project, Self-Care for Performers, which is a lot about embodiment and somatics and intimacy. And I bring a lot of those things into my work with Pages and Process. And sometimes I will bridge into practices that stretch the sort of Pages and Process part of things and evolve a little bit more into body-based practices here in my Patreon for Pages and Process. But what I want to come to today is sharing the books I've been using in the other project and just letting you know what they're like. So this first one is Essential Art Therapy Exercises, and it is Effective Techniques to Manage Anxiety, Depression, and PTSD by Leah Guzman. And it's a beautiful book that has a lot of different exercises in it. And we did 15 of these exercises for the first 15 days of that embodiment series. That felt really good. And at the same time, I had an experience there that I have had here too, which is sort of like vulnerability hangover, where I feel like some of them were so intimate and also got into the challenges of my inner experience so much that I needed to like back up and find more regulation, take a little break, a little breather, a little space. So after that, I think the next one we did was, and I think it was only one day, maybe two, but I think it was just one day of this book called Polyvagal Exercises for Safety and Connection, 50 Client-Centered Practices by Deb Dana. The foreword is by Stephen W. Porges, who these names are very well known in sort of the like somatic therapy, trauma, integration, nervous system education spheres, which is a lot of what I love to study, and finding ways to bridge those understandings into how I relate to myself in the world and to those in my community that have a challenging time with personality disorders, to also be able to speak to their nervous system. I'm gonna touch up a little bit and be a little broader so that I don't dysregulate myself. Sometimes when we speak very specifically about something, it can be really helpful and therapeutic. And also, I find that I need a lot of rest afterwards. So if I'm going to keep coming into connection with others, then I need to find a way to keep things light enough that I'm not tossing myself into dysregulation or triggering myself and making it hard for me to move forward. Anyways, this is a great book. And there are 50 exercises in here that are very helpful. It is designed for practitioners, like therapists, for clients. So there's a fair amount of languaging and things that can be kind of dense at times. But if you have a foundational understanding of that, it can be a really helpful book. It might be a little bit more chewy than an entry level. Then we have, I think this was the one I did after, was The War of Art and Breakthrough the Blocks and Win Your Inner Creative Battles by Stephen Pressfield. And it's all about like creative resistance. It's all about when we bump up against the hard stuff. I've had so much of that. Less with Pages and Process. Pages and Process I've designed very specifically to be like, how can I meet myself just where I'm at and not try so hard and just learn how to communicate with multiple people in a safe enough way. And part of that was by sharing my journaling process and practice at first. And I'm still doing that. I'm sharing my journal pages, and I was kind of unpacking the pages in a lot of my earlier videos for Pages and Process and in some of my Instagram videos there too. While I think it's a very valuable practice to do that. And I think that will always be a part somehow of the work that I do with this practice, this project, this Pages and Process channel that I have, community that I'm inviting you into. It also is, I need to diversify a little bit the way I think I'm coming in and out of connection with you to help me feel more well-rounded as a person. Like this feels like the next step in my creative recovery, interrelational wellness, learning how relationships can be safe enough to not have to recover from for such a long, long time. Oh, there's banging in the other room and there's a helicopter outside. Loud, loud, loud. Oh, it's an airplane, a little airplane. Hello, little airplane. Last night was so lovely. There were fireworks. I might show those to you at some point. We'll see. Okay, so great book, really helpful. In some ways, I, though, am at war with this book in certain ways because there's some deconstruction around some of the perspectives and ways of looking at stuff that I'm actively in the process of fighting, I guess. So my war of art is also in part fighting a bit of needing to have a war in regards to art. I don't want that. And how do we make peace and then move forward? How do we use the softness of ourselves, that lovely, luscious feminine energy that so many of us have, to not feel like we have to be in conflict in order to make progress, that it can naturally bloom from us when we are rooted securely in our lives and our sense of self and our special interests or curiosities. Next, we have Building a Story Brand by Donald Miller, and it says to clarify your message so customers will listen. So a lot of what I'm totally excited by is marketing and branding strategy. I love it. I think it's so interesting. I've studied it for over a decade. It's been one of my interests that I dive into very deeply. And while I feel pretty good about helping others with their connection to story brand, etc., I find it's hardest when we apply it to ourselves, and really finding how we clarify our experience can be one of the most life-changing and also confronting and also exciting and relationally rewarding things that I think we can do. And I've gone through so many iterations of practices with this, but I feel like there's something I'm trying to find inside of myself that I can already feel like as alive and present, that every time I do, something's like, no, that's not it. And I also have a sneaking suspicion that part of the way for and why I keep tossing out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak, from so much of the ground that I gain or seem to gain is also related to a lot of complex trauma. And so I'm learning how to recover there and recover that sort of inner, no, this isn't right. No, this doesn't feel right. No, this is off. And know that two things can be true simultaneously. One, I can release some of the perfectionism and the grip on matching my inner and outer experiences precisely and perfectly, and know that there's just gonna be room for the stuff, variances and miscommunications and people misinterpreting you and projections here and all of that stuff. And then I'm like, and that scares me. I'm aware of that, and that terrifies me. And also, this is a book I haven't read straight through, but I've used some of the exercises that have been really helpful. And then I think next we did a day or an exercise from The Artist's Way. This is a book by Julia Cameron, A Spiritual Path to Higher Creativity. And Elizabeth Gilbert says, the Artist's Way brings much insight, gently helping you see what is holding you back and showing you how to move forward. And this book I've spoken about a lot in both of my projects as being this sort of creative recovery beginning process for me, that I was in a really dark place a long time ago. I was leaving some projects and connections and community that I had really devoted and invested a lot of my time and energy into, and left completely defeated and depleted. And my mental health was in a terrible place. My physical health was in a terrible place. My spiritual health was just I kept trying, but it was like a trying. And then I read through this book. And at the time I was on the ground, fetal position, sobbing, this is who I am. And since then I have been, and Julia Cameron touches on this, that she uses the God word that I have not been able to reconcile with and don't want to. And in the way she describes why she's choosing to in this book, when I came to the book, even though I still wasn't I like that word, she described how she used it in a really clear way, and that it was more important about how you use your relationship with certain kinds of energies and perspectives than it was what word you chose to use for it. And since the last couple years, when I've really realized why so much of my life has been so hard, I kind of realized, and this is maybe touching into what I didn't want to talk about earlier that you guys have told me is helpful, is the God word is so often used as a weapon against creativity, against internal life force, against inner demons, and trying to suppress, contain, protect ourselves from certain kinds of energies that maybe are darker. Not to say that, like, I'm not going to speak about this book. It's been a while since I've read it because I've had such a hard time with that word that I haven't even been able to go back to it, even as a lot of what Julia Cameron's work does for me is super helpful. That's the main crux that I feel like I have, is this war between good and evil inside of me. And the evil part is actually the part that I really need to liberate, that there's this projection that has been placed onto what is evil as something to shun and stay away from. And while there is a degree of like, it's important to choose your focus, it's important to connect with things that are healthy for us. I also know from personal experience leading and facilitating group work in embodiment practices and improvisational sacred theater kind of work that there is a sense of clarity that the thing that might be causing the harm or seemingly causing the harm that something up and above might be looking down on. And I recognize that there are a lot of complexities into how different people utilize certain words and certain framings and certain kinds of Abrahamic religious concepts, which to me, it's really hard for me to not just feel overwhelmed by anger towards what so much of that kind of religious mental framework does to just so many people, so many bodies. It's heartbreaking. And it's such a big wash. Like, there's so much you can't control, right? There comes a point in a dysregulated nervous system. And I think a lot of how sometimes people relate to those religions is that it can throw a body into a frenzy and then either controlling or targeting, or there's just a lot. There's just a lot. And I feel like the masses, like the energy of like the energetic masses there. And it's just so much going on. And it's like, how do you, what do you, how, like, how? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that other than what I found with the energies in my internal landscape is that it helps me to be as close to something that's really harmful as possible while not letting it like metaphorically bite me, even as I've also gone through phases where I've energetically and emotionally been like, okay, what happens if I just kind of let the energy or the emotions, or like in my journaling process or in my somatic embodiment process of like, let's get to know this piece, this part, this inner part, this energetic consciousness that floats around the world or that is indicative of this massive energy, that if we can utilize a couple of things, one, that polyvagal theory and sort of like the neurobiological awareness of what's happening in a body, coupled with consent, transference, ability to come into connection with things like, it's a good segue into this book, The Art of Receiving and Giving, The Wheel of Consent by Betty Martin, DC. This book is beautiful. And it talks about how, I'm just going to read the back. In her framework, The Wheel of Consent, Dr. Betty Martin traces the fundamental roots of consent to our bodies, how we learn to ignore our desires and needs, and the harm caused when we do not honor our own limits or the limits of others. In a world where the #MeToo movement sheds light on boundary violations, The Wheel of Consent offers a deeply nuanced and precise way to practice consent as an agreement that brings integrity, responsibility, and joy into every interaction. About Dr. Betty Martin. She has had her hands on people professionally for more than 40 years, first as a chiropractor, and upon retiring from that practice as a certified surrogate partner, sacred, intimate, and somatic sex educator. Her explorations in somatic-based therapy and practices informed her creation of the framework, The Wheel of Consent, Betty co-founded the School of Consent in 2018 and travels around the world teaching touch practitioners, therapists, and professionals how to create empowered agreements in their client sessions. I love this. I used to be a massage therapist and as a performing artist. Like both of those things are really emotionally, physically, relationally intimate practices. There's a lot of taboo also in both of them where there can be sometimes a pushing of my boundaries that I've felt has happened. And as a teacher, educator for the performing arts, I've also had a lot of history pushing my students because that's how I was taught to teach. And so I didn't know that I was really blowing past my own body's signals in my training as I was being trained, because that's what my instructors asked me to do, was sort of like compartmentalize or bypass my body's signals to like slow down or not this way, or like this isn't working, or I need something different. And I know now that I have systemic hypermobility, and there a lot of dancers do have that, but there's a kind that's not harmful, and then there's a kind that like causes a lot of challenges, and it can be a struggle for one to deal with both emotionally and just the physical pain of it. There's something called spontaneous subluxation where your joints just go out. I have that, like stretching in bed, and this has happened since I was like little girl. I would have a lot of physical pain, and so it's not just something that as I've aged has developed. It's actually gotten better as I've gotten older because I treat myself more tenderly now than I used to, given the insight I now have that my body needs to be treated with a lot of relational care. And I really need to tune into it and listen to its needs and listen to whether or not there's consent. What I love about this, the art of receiving and giving, is it's also so much about pleasure and being able to find a space where when we can clarify boundaries of like, what are you comfortable with? What are you not comfortable with? What am I comfortable with? What am I not comfortable with? When we can agree upon a place of like, this is where the comfort is, then we have freedom to explore and create and express. And I think that kind of container is the kind of container that I'm looking to find more and more of for myself. And hopefully for you too, to feel that in Pages in Process and in parallel, self-care for performers too. Oftentimes these projects I find will feed each other in really beautiful ways, but it's a different way that I'm processing my community with you versus my community with that project. And this one feels a little bit more intimate. It feels more like I'm talking to myself in the kind, sweet, loving way, and then sharing that with you and inviting you into that, as well as giving myself permission to be with like the harder parts of both practice and people and whatnot. But with self-care for performers, it feels very specifically like how to recover from how we've hurt ourselves and how to keep moving forward where we're not doing that, but we can still have like audacious goals. We can still have a lot of freeform wishing that also has a basic roadmap to work from. Which brings me to the last book, The Drummer and the Great Mountain, a guidebook to transforming adult ADD, ADHD by Michael Joseph Ferguson. And I mentioned the awareness that just like with hypermobility, I didn't realize that was something that I needed to be navigating, and the degree to which it was a challenge for me to show up to basic kinds of movement and exercise, that it wasn't necessarily challenging in the same way for the majority of others. And I didn't know why things were so emotionally, physically, energetically taxing for me, and others could keep going or move faster. I also am realizing that there's a fair amount of neurodivergence that I have when I was growing up. And they talk about this a lot, and I haven't been diagnosed, but this is more just, I really relate to a lot of the writings, both about ADD, ADHD, and autism. And one of my early childhood caregivers has self-diagnosed as autistic, and both of my parents, I think, very clearly have some form of ADD, ADHD. I still don't know. It's like how much of my patterns are learned versus how much of them are just how I'm built versus does it really even matter? Finding a way to find a way through has been something I've been doing since I was a little girl, because so much of the way my mind worked was more neurotypical than my core childhood caregivers. So I spent a lot of time being the more neurotypical person in the family unit, and also developing a lot of neurodiversity because of the environment I was in. So there's this interesting line there that it's like, I don't feel like I have clarity around where I belong or fit in or what I can use or utilize. But what I have been finding with this project, just working with myself as opposed to so much working with another, is that I can do both. And I have done both. And depending on what inner part of myself is alive and active, I can utilize one or the other to either enhance creativity neurodivergently or to help orient, ground, and direct if I'm feeling chaotic and overwhelmed. So that there's this beautiful balance that can take place. And there's a wonderful aspect of this book where it seems to be inclusive of the creative, very sometimes chaotic and enlivened experience that neurodivergence can bring, while also offering the possibility of exercises that could help inspire a more compatible environment and clarity of relationship to self and purpose and action and having some sort of directional intention that one works into, which does, I think, help us show up into society in a way that maybe is more compatible to societal expectations, and not to be like you should meet society's expectations. But one of the things I'm in recovery from is under earning, overworking, under earning. I'm finding that there's a degree of recovery that feels like is present in this book that allows me to feel into the sense of like, oh, I am worthy of making a good living, feeling supported financially, that it's not outlandish to think that I could do that when I've tried in the past. And it's not like I actually was very considering when I was going to school. I was like, should I be an accountant, an astronomer, or some form of artist? And I was really into photography, but I knew it was expensive. And I was like, well, what can I do that doesn't cost a lot? I was really into like painting and things. I would have loved to do that. I was like, oh, dance, it's just your body. Like it won't be so pricey. So I made the choice to go into dancing, choosing that as my artistic medium, really because of financial limitations more than like, I want to be a dancer. My mother was a dancer. My father was a martial artist. So it also made synchronistic sense for me too. And I had a lot of intergenerational strengths just from growing up in the kind of environment that I did. But I don't know. I think this is our video for today. I want to do another pages and process where I'm processing my pages, but I also don't feel quite ready yet. So I'm going to let that be okay. And I'm going to let this be our little holiday practice. And then we'll see what the videos where I'm sharing my words, what words want to come forward, what words don't want to come forward. I'll keep sharing on Sundays in our Patreon weekly word share, which is a place to come into connection with yourself. I add a couple of journal prompts. I share the video for the week and the blog post that I've just started to accompany with our weekly videos. And sometimes I also share a little bit about how I've been for the week, a little touch point of connection for us, an invitation for you to just slow down a moment, be with your cup of tea, and do a little self-inquiry, always with an invitation without an expectation that you are invited to share in the comments anything that you would like in community witness within the Patreon to bring forward, whether that's excerpts from your own writing or reflections about the videos and prompts that I'm sharing or direct response to some of the prompts that I post. But it's just a way to invite a sense of, can we feel safe with ourselves? And then can we feel safe in relationship and witness of other and of other witnessing us? It's a scary thing, so I don't take it lightly. And I don't want to rush you in that process if it's something you feel like you have a desire for, but not quite a readiness for. I think it's really important to listen to the readiness of our bodies while willing to stretch ourselves as we really feel there's a capacity to not stretch ourselves so far that we have some sort of fracture or break or emotional experience we have to recover from for long periods of time, which I tend to do. I tend to push myself too much, too far, too fast. And I'm learning how to not do that and be a little more still, a little more contained, a little more willing to meet myself honestly and then share that honesty with you. And sometimes what happens as I'm doing that is I go, oh, that was too much. And I go, okay, how do I share from here? So some of my shares are like that too. I don't know if you relate, but it's nice to be here with you. Thank you for taking the time to watch this, and I will see you next time. Bye.